The year was 1883, and the town of Salvation Point was a fresh wound on the face of the Arizona desert. It existed because of a shallow creek and a deep vein of silver, and it held on through sheer, stubborn human will. The land itself was a study in harshness. It was a place of endless sun-bleached distances, where the sky was a hard, metallic blue, and the mountains on the horizon were purple shadows, promising nothing but more rock and heat. Dust was the town's constant companion. It coated the raw lumber of the buildings, settled in the creases of every face, and painted the world in shades of weary brown. This was a land that stripped a person down to their bones. It demanded everything and gave back just enough to keep you fighting. People spoke often of freedom, of justice, but what they truly craved was survival. Sarah Brennan stood on a platform of splintered wood, erected in front of the town's combined saloon and courthouse. She was 26 years old, and she held her daughter, Emma, pressed tight against her chest. Emma was 8 months old, a small, warm weight wrapped in a clean but faded blanket, blissfully asleep, unaware that her life was about to be decided by the highest bidder. Sarah's husband, Thomas, had been dead for 6 months. He was a good man, a quiet man, who believed in the promise of the West. He had seen a future in a small patch of rocky land just outside of town. A rock slide in the new silver mine had taken him instantly. It was a clean death, the mine foreman had said, as if that were some comfort. It left Sarah with a half-built cabin, a field of stubborn stones, and a crushing debt at the bank. The bank belonged to Horace Grimm, Mr. Grimm was a man who had come west not to build, but to own. He was always dressed in a black wool suit, despite the suffocating heat, his white shirt a stark, accusing presence in the dusty town. He was not a physically large man, but he filled every room he entered, sucking the air and hope out of it. He had seen Sarah's plight as an opportunity. The loan agreement Thomas had signed, with its obscure widow's forfeiture clause, was Grimm's own invention. It stated that in the event of a borrower's death, if the widow could not settle the debt within 90 days, the bank could claim all assets, and if those assets were insufficient, the widow's guardianship and service could be offered to the town to satisfy the remaining sum. It was, in polite terms, a public auction of an indentured servant. In the raw, honest language of the desert, it was a sale. The entire town of Salvation Point had gathered. They stood in a half-circle, their faces a mixture of emotions that twisted Sarah's stomach. She saw pity in the eyes of Mrs. Miller, the baker's wife, who quickly looked away, ashamed. She saw a cold, assessing curiosity from some of the miners and ranchers, their gazes lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. But mostly, she saw helplessness. These were not evil people, not all of them, but they were people ground down by the same harsh land. They had their own families to feed, their own debts to Horace Grimm. They could offer sympathy, but they could not offer salvation. Her husband's family, what remained of it? Was there Thomas's older brother, Arthur, stood near the front, his arms crossed. He had offered to take the farm. He would, he had said, graciously allow Sarah to live there as his housekeeper, without pay. He had not mentioned Emma at all. When Sarah had refused, his face had hardened into this mask of righteous anger. He saw her public humiliation as a justified punishment for her pride in this small, brittle society. A woman alone had no power. She was a problem to be solved, or a burden to be discarded. The auctioneer, a nervous man named Silas Croft, who usually sold cattle, cleared his throat. He read the proclamation in a monotone, his eyes fixed on the paper as if it might bite him. He spoke of the debt owed, a sum of $400. He spoke of the bank's legal right. He never once looked at Sarah. Sarah kept her eyes on the distant purple mountains. She would not cry. She would not beg. She had spent her tears in the long, silent nights in the cabin, clutching her daughter and staring into the cold darkness. Today, her silence was her last possession. She held her chin high, her back straight. She was Thomas Brennan's wife. She was Emma Brennan's mother. They could take everything else, but she would not let them see her break. Horace Grimm watched from the porch of the bank, a slight smile on his thin lips. This was not just about money for him. It was about order. It was about demonstrating his power. A man in his pocket, a livery stable owner, opened the bidding. $20. The amount was an insult, a price for a lame horse. The crowd shuffled. Someone else, perhaps moved by shame, called out 30. Arthur Brennan remained silent, his face a smug mask. The bidding was not meant to be fair. It was meant to be a lesson. Grimm's man raised it to 35. A rider had approached the edge of the crowd, unnoticed in the tension of the moment. He sat easily on a tall buckskin horse, and he had been watching the scene for several minutes. He was a stranger to Salvation Point. His clothes were simple, a dusty canvas jacket, worn denim trousers, and scuffed boots that had seen hard miles. He wore his hat low, shadowing his face. He looked like any other cowhand drifting between jobs, yet there was a stillness about him that set him apart. The men who lounged on the saloon porch, men who judged others quickly, found their eyes drawn to him. He carried no fancy, silver-plated revolver, just a plain wooden-handled Colt low on his hip, the leather of the holster worn smooth from practice, not polish. As Silas Croft's voice wavered, asking for 40, the stranger spoke. His voice was not loud, but it was clear and carried the weight of authority. $500. The words fell into the silence like stones into a deep well. The crowd turned as one to look at him. Silas Croft's jaw dropped. Horace Grimm's smile vanished, replaced by a sharp, sudden frown. $500 was more than the debt. It was a ridiculous sum. Silas Croft stammered, Do I hear 510? The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, looping his reins over the hitching post. He walked directly toward the platform, not through the crowd, but as if the crowd was not there. People moved out of his way. He stopped at the base of the platform and looked up, not at Sarah, but at the auctioneer. He repeated his words, slower this time, as if speaking to a child. I said $500. That is my bid. It covers the debt and the auctioneer's fee. It is the only bid you will receive. Horace Grimm stepped off the bank's porch, his voice sharp. This is an auction, sir, not a private sale. The bidding will continue. He motioned to his man. The man, looking nervous, called out, 505. The stranger turned his head, and for the first time, his eyes met Grimm's. He did not seem angry. He seemed, if anything, tired. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather satchel. From it, he produced a stack of bills and a small, heavy pouch of gold. My name is James Cordell, he said, his voice still calm, but now it had an edge that made the back of Sarah's neck tingle. I own the Cordell Ranch over in the Verde Valley. That is a cashier's draft for $500 drawn on the bank in Prescott. And this, he added, dropping the pouch onto the auctioneer's table with a heavy thud, is another $500 in gold. The first is for the bank. The second is for the lady. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $1,000. It was a fortune. It was more money than Salvation Point saw in a month. This proceeding is a disgrace, Cordell stated, looking around at the silent townspeople. You should all be ashamed. He then fixed his gaze on Horace Grimm. You, sir, are a vulture. You will take your $500 and you will sign a document releasing this woman and her child from all claims. Or we can discuss the matter with the territorial marshal. I am sure he would be very interested in your creative banking clauses. Grimm's face went pale, then purple. He knew the name Cordell. Everyone in the territory knew of the Cordell Ranch. It was a sprawling empire of cattle and land, run by a man who was rumored to be a millionaire, a man who valued his privacy and dealt with problems directly. Grimm had overplayed his hand, and he knew it. He was a spider, but he had just run into a boot. Silas Croft, seeing his chance, slammed his ledger shut. Sold to Mr. James Cordell for the sum of $500. This auction is concluded. James Cordell did not look at the crowd. He did not acknowledge Grimm, who was now spitting orders at his man to fetch the paperwork. Instead, he looked up at Sarah. She was trembling now, the adrenaline fading, leaving a cold sickness in its place. She had been bought. The name of the buyer did not matter. The price did not matter. She had been stood up like a piece of a livestock and sold. Her eyes met Cordell's. She saw a strong, sun-weathered face, a square jaw, and eyes that were a deep, unreadable gray. She expected to see triumph, or pity, or worse, the look of ownership she had seen in the other men's faces. She saw none of those things. He looked at her, and at the sleeping child in her arms, and his expression was one of profound, cold sorrow. It was not for her. It was something deeper, something she could not understand. He seemed to be looking at her and seeing a ghost. He was not a savior. He was a man driven by a different kind of debt, a private one he was repaying to the past. He had acted not out of kindness, but out of a fierce, angry sense of justice. He had seen a wrong, and he had righted it, as simply and forcefully as he would set a broken bone or shoot a rabid wolf. Horace Grimm, his face a mask of fury, shoved a piece of paper at Cordell. Cordell signed it, then handed the draft to Silas Croft, not to Grimm. He pushed the pouch of gold across the table towards Sarah. "That is yours," he said. Sarah stared at the small leather bag. She could not move. Arthur Brennan stepped forward, his voice oily. "Mr. Cordell, sir, perhaps you have been hasty. This woman, she is willful. She has no gratitude." Cordell turned his head, his gray eyes settling on Arthur. He said nothing. He simply looked. Arthur, who was a bully and therefore a coward, faltered, took a step back, and melted into the crowd. James Cordell turned back to Sarah. The street was emptying quickly. The show was over. The shame, however, was just beginning. Sarah could feel the whispers starting, the speculation. She had been bought by a millionaire cattleman. Her reputation, already fragile, was now destroyed. Cordell gestured with his head toward the street. "Get your things. You and the child are coming with me." His voice was not cruel, but it was not kind. It was the voice of a man giving an order, a man who had just purchased her service and expected to be obeyed. Sarah finally found her voice. It was a dry whisper. "Where?" "To my ranch." She clutched Emma tighter. The baby stirred, making a small, fretful sound. Sarah looked at the gold, then at this stranger, then at the townspeople who were already turning their backs on her. She had no home. She had no family. She had no choice. With the last of her pride, she pulled her worn shawl tighter around her daughter and, without taking the gold, she stepped down from the platform, ready to follow her new master. James Cordell did not wait for her thanks. He did not wait for her to process the violent shift in her life. He simply turned, his worn boots stirring the dust, and walked back to his horse. He retrieved the pouch of gold from the auctioneer's table and pressed it into her hand. His fingers were rough, his touch impersonal, but the leather bag was heavy. It was real. "A debt is paid," he said, his voice low. "This is wages. You will earn it." Sarah's fingers closed around the bag. Wages. The word was a small, hard stone of dignity she could hold on to. It meant she was not a purchase. She was an employee. It was a lie. Perhaps a polite fiction they would both agree to. But it was a necessary one. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He told her to go to her cabin, to gather what mattered. He would bring a wagon from the livery. He gave her 1 hour. The walk back to the small, half-finished cabin on the edge of town was the longest of her life. The whispers followed her, the eyes of the townspeople burning into her back. She was no longer Sarah Brennan, the grieving widow. She was now the woman Cordell bought. She felt like a marked woman. Though the brand was invisible, she packed with a numb efficiency. There was little to take. Thomas's clothes. She left. She took her own few dresses, Emma her blankets and diapers, a small wooden box that held her marriage certificate and a tintype of Thomas, his face serious and hopeful. She looked at the cabin, the rough walls Thomas had raised with his own hands. It was meant to be their future. Now it was just a wooden shell, a monument to a life that had never begun. When she returned to the center of town, a simple buckboard wagon was waiting. James Cordell was already on his horse, standing apart, a young cowhand, his face barely covered with a pale fuzz, was managing the wagon. Cordell had retrieved her husband's land deed and the paid banknote from Silas Croft. He handed them to her. "The land is yours," he said. "The debt is clear." Sarah looked at the papers. She had nothing to pay him with, except the service she had already been sold for. The land was worthless to her now. Still, she took the papers and tucked them into her bag. The young driver, who introduced himself as Billy, helped her onto the wagon seat. He was nervous, his eyes darting between Sarah and his employer. He tried to offer a kind smile when he took Emma her small bundle. The ride out of Salvation Point was silent. Sarah did not look back. She fixed her eyes forward, on the vast, unforgiving expanse of the desert. The landscape was brutal. Giant saguaros stood like silent, wounded sentinels. The wind was a constant, dry breath, picking up sand and grit that stung her eyes and caked her lips. For hours, they moved through this empty world. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady, rhythmic plodding of the horses. James Cordell rode ahead, or sometimes to the side. He never rode with them. He was a remote figure, part of the landscape himself, as hard and unyielding as the distant mountains. Sarah watched him, trying to understand the man who had just spent a fortune to buy her, only to declare her an employee. He sat his horse with an easy, powerful grace, a man perfectly at home in this desolate place. He was not acting purely from a sense of justice. She had seen it in his eyes. That moment he had looked at her on the platform. His gaze had been sharp, but it was also filled with a pain so deep it was almost black. He had not been seeing her, Sarah Brennan. He had been seeing someone else. James Cordell was, in fact, seeing a ghost. Her name had been Eleanor. She was his wife. She had been dead for 3 years. Eleanor had been a woman from the East, full of life and laughter, who had followed him west with a brave heart. She had not been strong enough for the land, but she had been stubborn. They were building their life, much as Sarah and Thomas had been. Then came the accident. A broken wagon wheel on a high mountain pass. A lurch, a scream, and a 1,000-foot drop into a rocky canyon. He had been riding just behind her. He had watched it happen. He had climbed down to her, his hands raw and bleeding, but she was gone. The aftermath had been its own kind of hell. The banker in that town, a man much like Horace Grimm, had tried to claim their wagon, their horses, their supplies, against a loan Cordell had taken for his first herd. He had looked at Cordell's staggering grief and seen only opportunity. Cordell, in a cold, silent rage, had paid the man, and then he had methodically, legally, and utterly destroyed him. He had bought the man's bank and sold it for parts. When he had ridden into Salvation Point and seen Sarah on that platform, holding her child, facing that circle of vultures, he had not seen a stranger. He had seen Eleanor. He had seen the same injustice, the same predatory circling. The rage he had buried for 3 years had come surging back. His action had not been charity. It had been a reckoning. He was protecting this woman. Yes, but he was also shielding the memory of his wife. He was fighting the battle he had lost 3 years ago. This was why he could not look at Sarah. She was a living reminder of his failure. His coldness was not for her. It was for himself, and for the woman he could not save. He had bought Sarah her freedom, but he was still trapped by his own past. Late in the afternoon, the land began to change. The flat desert floor gave way to rolling hills covered in dry grass. They moved up into a high valley, greener and cooler than the world below. They passed huge herds of cattle, all bearing the same brand, a simple C over a bar. This was the Cordell Ranch. It was not a ranch, it was a kingdom. The main house was not a cabin. It was a long, low adobe and timber building, built to last 1,000 years. It had a wide, covered porch and real glass in the windows. It sat on a rise, overlooking a creek, surrounded by barns, corrals, and bunkhouses. It was a fortress of industry and wealth. Sarah felt a new wave of intimidation. This was not a farm. This was the home of a millionaire. As the wagon pulled up, a woman came out onto the porch. She was older, in her 50s, with gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her eyes taut. She wore a starched white apron over a plain gray dress. She looked, Sarah thought, like a general assessing new recruits. Cordell dismounted and spoke to the woman in a low voice. Sarah could not hear the words, but she saw the woman's eyes flick to her, then to Emma. The woman nodded once, her expression unchanging. Cordell walked to the wagon. "This is Mrs. Albright," he said. "She is the housekeeper. She will show you to your room." He did not offer Sarah his hand. He simply stood back as Billy helped her down. Sarah's legs were stiff, her entire body aching from the long, jolting ride. She held Emma close. The baby, sensing the change, had begun to fuss. "Mrs. Albright," Sarah Brennan said, trying to keep her voice steady. The housekeeper just nodded. "Follow me. Your daughter is restless." Sarah followed the woman into the house. It was cool and dark inside. The furniture was heavy, made of dark, polished wood. It was a masculine house, clean and orderly, but without a single soft touch. There were no paintings, no curtains, just functional, expensive things. Mrs. Albright led her down a hall to a small, plain room at the back of the house. It was near the kitchen. It contained a narrow bed, a simple wooden dresser, and a washstand with a pitcher and bowl. It was a servant's room. "You will sleep here," Mrs. Albright said, her voice as starched as her apron. "Mr. Cordell said you are to work. You will help me in the house, the kitchen, mending, laundry. You will be expected to be ready by 5 in the morning. Meals are with the staff." "Understood." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah whispered. "A cot can be brought in for the child." "Thank you, ma'am." Mrs. Albright looked at Emma, her expression softening for just a fraction of a second. "She is small. You can keep her with you as you work, as long as she does not interfere." She looked at Sarah again, her gaze sharp and assessing. "Mr. Cordell is a fair man, but he is not a soft man. He expects hard work and no trouble. You understand your position here." Sarah felt a flush of her old shame. "I do. I am grateful for the work." "Mrs. Albright nodded. "Good. Supper is at 6. And then she was gone, leaving Sarah alone in the small, bare room. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress thin but clean. She looked down at Emma, who was now staring up at her with wide, curious eyes. She had been saved from Horace Grimm, only to be delivered into a new kind of servitude. She was in a stranger's house, in a room meant for a hired girl, bound to a man who looked at her with the eyes of a haunted man. He was cold, not cruel, but the coldness was a wall she could not see over. The ranch was isolated, miles from any other sign of life. The wind outside had a high, lonely sound as it swept through the valley. It was the only sound. The silence of the house was as vast and empty as the desert she had left behind. Sarah held her daughter close, rocking her gently. She had no choice. She had to survive. She had to build a life here. in this cold, silent house, with this cold, silent man. She had to hold on to her dignity, that small, hard stone, and prove that she was more than just the woman he had bought. The struggle was not over. It had just changed its name. Life at the Cordell Ranch settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of a vast, working cattle operation. Sarah's days began long before dawn. In the cool darkness of the adobe house, she would rise, dress silently, and check on Emma, who slept in a small cot beside her bed. Then she would go to the kitchen, where Mrs. Albright would already be stoking the massive wood stove. Her work was hard and unending. She scoured pots, scrubbed floors, kneaded endless loaves of bread for the cowhands, and spent hours over a steaming tub of lye soap and laundry. Emma was her constant shadow. Sarah would carry her in a sling on her back, or place her on a blanket in a corner of the kitchen, where the baby would watch her with wide, solemn eyes. The house itself was a source of profound loneliness. It was a place of shadows and silence, built for a family that did not exist. James Cordell was a ghost in his own home. He was the first to rise and the last to return, spending his days on the range. He took his supper not in the dining room, but in his study, a room filled with books and maps that smelled of leather and tobacco. Sarah would bring his tray, set it on his desk, and leave without a word. He would nod, his eyes on his ledgers, never on her. Mrs. Albright, the housekeeper, was a stern but just woman. She ruled the house with an iron will, demanding perfection. Yet, she was not unkind. She saw Sarah's quiet diligence, the way she never complained, the way she cared for her daughter. She had been shocked when Cordell had arrived with them, but she, like everyone on the ranch, owed her loyalty to him. She showed Sarah how to manage the work, and in her own gruff way, ensured Sarah and Emma had what they needed. But Sarah was not built to be idle, or to be a simple servant. The tiny room, the endless chores, the suffocating silence of the owner. It was a half-life. She had to make something of her own. Behind the kitchen was a patch of hard, dry earth. Thomas had taught her how to read the land. She saw that the creek was close, that the morning sun hit the spot without the scorch of the afternoon. She found an old spade. She began to dig. She broke the earth, cleared the rocks, and hauled buckets of water until her back screamed. She found a forgotten chicken coop, broken and abandoned. She mended the slats, patched the roof, and spoke to Mrs. Albright. The housekeeper had raised an eyebrow, but had given her permission to take feed from the stables. Sarah found a setting hen, and soon, the sound of clucking chickens joined the whisper of the wind. Weeks passed. The garden took root, small. Determined green shoots pushed up from the dark soil. She had fresh eggs for the kitchen. Mrs. Albright accepted the offerings with a curt nod, but Sarah saw a flicker of approval in her eyes. She was not just the woman who was bought. She was Sarah Brennan, a woman who could make things grow. James Cordell said nothing, but one evening, he stood on the back porch for a long time, looking at the neat rows of her garden, at the mended coop. He smoked a cigar, his face hidden in the twilight, and then went back inside. The next day, a cowhand left a roll of new chicken wire and a 50-pound sack of seed by the kitchen door. There was no note. The tension between them remained. It was a living thing, a third presence in the house. He was her master, her employer, her savior, and a complete stranger. He never pressured her, never made an inappropriate gesture, never even spoke a personal word. His coldness was a perfect, impenetrable wall. She felt his eyes on her sometimes, when she was in the garden or sitting in the kitchen rocking Emma. It was a heavy, assessing gaze, a look she could not decipher. It was not desire, it was something deeper and more painful. Then, the early winter winds brought a sickness. It started with the cowhands, a cough that settled deep in the chest, and then, one night, Sarah woke to the sound of Emma's breathing. It was a dry, shallow, rasping sound, like paper tearing. By morning, the baby was burning with fever. Sarah was frantic. She bathed Emma in cool water, tried to make her nurse, but the baby was listless, her small face flushed and hot. Mrs. Albright came, her face grim. She brought mustard plasters and onion syrups. All the old remedies. Nothing worked. The fever climbed. Salvation Point was a full day's ride, and the man there, Dr. Miller, was more butcher than healer. Sarah was trapped, alone with her terror. She sat in her small, dark room, rocking her daughter, her heart frozen. Emma's breathing grew thinner, a tiny, struggling whistle. Late that night, James Cordell returned from a long ride. He was weary, covered in dust, and walking down the hall to his study when he heard a sound. It was not a cry, but a small, desperate gasp, followed by a woman's muffled, heartbroken sob. He stopped, his hand on the door to his study. He never went to the servants' wing. It was a part of the house he ignored. But the sound Autopro too. It was the sound of the worst moment of his life. He walked down the hall and knocked softly on her door. The sobbing stopped. After a long moment, the door opened. Sarah stood there, her face a pale, tear-stained mask in the lamplight. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. He looked past her. At the cot, Emma was barely moving, her little chest hitching with effort. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rough. "Fever," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "She cannot breathe." "Mrs. Albright tried Autopro 2, I think Autopro 2, I think she is Autopro 2. She could not say the word. He pushed past her, gently, and went to the cot. He placed his large, calloused hand on Emma's tiny, burning forehead. His face, usually so controlled, became a mask of grim, focused intensity. He had seen this before. He had seen it in calves, and he had seen it in Eleanor's younger sister, long ago. "The creek. Get me a bucket of the coldest water from the creek." "Not the well. And bring me the bottle of whiskey from my study." Sarah stared at him, uncomprehending. "Now, Sarah," he commanded. His voice snapped her out of her frozen state. She ran. She grabbed a bucket and ran into the freezing night, down to the rushing creek, her slippers sinking into the mud. She returned, breathless, bucket spilling icy water. He had Emma out of the cot, unwrapped from her blankets. He took the bucket, soaked a clean cloth, and began to bathing the baby. Emma's skin was bright red. He wrapped the baby in a dry towel, then took the whiskey. He poured a small amount onto his fingers and rubbed it vigorously over Emma's chest and back. The baby, shocked by the cold and the fumes, let out a thin, gasping wail. "It is a good sound," he said, his voice tight. "It means she is fighting." He sat in the room's only chair, holding Emma. He sent Sarah for more water, for more dry cloths, for hours. They worked. He did not speak, except to give an order. Sarah did not speak, except to obey. They were two people bound together by a single, desperate purpose. He was not the ranch owner. She was not the purchased widow. They were two allies against the dark. She watched him. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his large, rough hands were impossibly gentle. He held Emma against his own chest, skin to skin, sharing his own warmth, whispering to her, "Come on, little one. You fight, you fight." This was not the cold, distant man from the auction. This was not the silent master of the house. This was someone else, a man who understood grief, who knew how to fight. Near 4 a.m, the baby's breathing began to deepen. The terrible, rasping sound faded. The fever had not broken, but it had retreated. Emma fell into a true, deep sleep against his chest. Sarah was sitting on the edge of her bed, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She was shaking from cold and exhaustion. He looked over at her. His face was gray with fatigue. He stood, slowly, and placed Emma back in the cot, covering her carefully. "She will sleep now," he said. "The worst is past. You need to sleep, too." He walked to the door. Sarah stood up, her legs unsteady. "Mr. Cordell Auto Pro 2, she began, her voice a dry rasp. He stopped, his back to her. "Thank you. You Auto Pro 2, you saved her." He did not turn around. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she almost could not hear it. "No one should have to lose a child." He pulled the door quietly shut, leaving her alone with her sleeping daughter. The next morning, the wall was back. He was at the breakfast table when she entered the kitchen, but he was speaking to his foreman. He nodded to her, the same brief, impersonal gesture as always. The shared intimacy of the night, the desperate fight for Emma's life, might never have happened. But something had changed. The silence between them was different. It was no longer a void. It was a space filled with a shared, unspoken truth. A week later, Billy, the young cowhand, returned from a supply run to Salvation Point. He sought Sarah out in the kitchen, twisting his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low, "there's trouble." Sarah's heart went cold. "What is it?" "It's that banker, Grimm. He's been talking. He's telling folks that Mr. Cordell had no right Auto Pro 2, that he, stole you." "Stole me?" "He's telling the town council you re-Auto Pro 2 town property, that your debt was to the bank, and the bank is part of the town. And Auto Pro 2, well, he's saying you should be brought back to work for the town. He's saying Mr. Cordell is Auto Pro 2 keeping you, against your will." Sarah dropped the potato she was holding. It hit the floor with a dull thud. "They can't. He paid the debt. Grimm is saying the law Auto Pro 2, that widow's forfeiture, Auto Pro 2, it ain't about money. It's about service. And he's got Arthur Brennan, your brother-in-law, agreeing with him. They're talking about sending the marshal out here." Sarah fled the kitchen, her hands shaking. She found Cordell in his office, studying a map. She burst in without knocking. "They are coming for me." He looked up, his eyes sharp. "Who?" "Horace Grimm, the town. They say I belong to them. They're sending the marshal." She was pacing, her panic rising. She was trapped. She looked at this powerful man, who had saved her daughter, who had bought her life. "You have to tell them," she pleaded. "Tell them I am your Auto Pro 2, your servant. Tell them I'm paying off the debt." He stood up slowly. He walked around the desk until he was standing in front of her. "You are not my servant." "Then what am I?" she cried, the words tearing out of her. "The woman you bought your Auto Pro 2, your prisoner. They think you are keeping me here. They think Auto Pro 2. She stopped, unable to say the ugly word that hung in the air between them. She put her hands to her face. "I cannot go back. I will not let them take Emma." He was silent for a long time. His face was hard, unreadable. "Let them come," he said, his voice flat and cold. "What?" "The marshal is welcome on my land. He can ask you. You can tell him you are here of your own free will." "Free will?" Sarah gave a bitter laugh. "What free will do I have? I have no money, nowhere to go. This ranch is a cage, just a bigger one than Grimm's bank. I'm just as trapped here as I was there. The only difference is the master." The words hung in the air. She had finally said it. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not coldness, but a flash of real anger. "You think I'm the same as him?" "I Auto Pro 2, then I don't know," she whispered, terrified by her own boldness. "I know you are a good man. You saved my daughter, but you Auto Pro 2, you own me." He stepped back, as if she had struck him. He looked at her, at this woman he had saved, and he saw the truth of her words. He had rescued her from one prison, only to put her in another. He had done it to soothe his own ghosts, but he had never considered her. "I will not let them take you," he said, his voice quiet, all the anger gone. "Horace Grimm will not have you. I will, Auto Pro 2. I will handle this." He turned away from her, staring out the window at the land he owned. Sarah stood in the middle of the room, her heart pounding. He had promised to protect her, but the cost of that protection was her freedom. She was torn between her deep, growing gratitude for this man and the fierce, burning need to be her own person. The battle was no longer just with Horace Grimm. It was now with the man who had saved her. The air on the ranch grew thick with waiting. James Cordell did not go to Salvation Point. He sent no messages. He simply continued his work, his face a mask of iron. He was a man bracing for a storm. Sarah, caught in the awful quiet, found her fear replaced by a strange, brittle anger. He had promised to handle this, but his handling felt like silence, like the same passivity that had allowed her to be put on that platform in the first place. She worked in her garden, her hands moving with a frantic energy, pulling weeds that were not there. The storm broke on a Tuesday. Billy rode in from the high pastures, his horse in a lather, a wagon and 3 riders. He called out to the foreman, "They are at the valley gate. Looks like the marshal." A cold silence fell over the ranch. The cowhands stopped their work, gathering in a loose, protective semicircle near the main house. Mrs. Albright came out onto the porch, her hands wrapped in her apron, her face as hard as adobe. Sarah ran to her room. She picked up Emma, her heart a cold, pounding drum in her chest. She held her daughter close, smoothing her fine hair. She would not let them see her cry. She had made that promise to herself before, but this time, it was different. This was not just about pride. It was about her child. She walked out onto the porch just as James Cordell emerged from his study. He did not look at her. He stood at the top of the porch steps, a tall, unmoving figure, and watched the wagon approach. It was not just a wagon. Marshal Elias Thorne, a weary man with a tarnished badge, sat beside the driver, riding behind him, their faces grim with self-importance. Were Horace Grimm and Arthur Brennan? Grimm's eyes, small and dark, immediately fixed on Sarah. A look of triumph, of possessive hunger, crossed his face. Arthur looked at the ground, then at Cordell, then at Sarah, his expression a sour mix of resentment and righteousness. James Cordell did not move. He waited until they had all dismounted and stood at the base of his porch. "Marshal," he said, his voice a low rumble, "this is private land. State your business." Marshal Thorne had the decency to look uncomfortable. He took off his hat, wiping the sweat from the leather band. "Mr. Cordell, I am here on an official matter for the town of Salvation Point." "It is about the woman," Grimm interrupted, stepping forward, his voice sharp and eager. He pointed a thin finger at Sarah. "That woman, Sarah Brennan, is bound by law to the town. You unlawfully interfered with a legal proceeding." Interfered Cordell's voice was dangerously quiet. "I paid the debt in full." "The debt is not the issue," Grimm snapped. "The widow's forfeiture clause, a legal and binding contract, stipulates service. The town council has met. They have voted. She is to be returned to Salvation Point to work off her obligation. You are, sir, harboring town property." Arthur Brennan found his voice. Stepping up beside Grimm, "She is a Brennan. She has shamed our family name. She belongs with us, where she can be properly looked after and taught her duties." Sarah clutched Emma so tightly the baby let out a small whimper. She felt the eyes of the cowhands, of Billy, of Mrs. Albright. She was on a platform again, the whole world judging her. Marshal Thorne turned his weary eyes to Cordell. "Sir, the talk in town is ugly. They are saying you took this woman, that you are Auto Pro 2 keeping her here. Against her will." He looked at Sarah. His gaze softened with a trace of pity. "Ma'am, the town council has empowered me to ask you, Are you here of your own free will? This was it. The question. Sarah looked from the marshal to Horace Grimm's sneering face. She looked at her brother-in-law, who had offered her servitude. Then she looked at James Cordell. He was not looking at her. He was watching the marshal. She realized, leaving the choice entirely to her. He was giving her the voice they had tried to take away. Her own voice was shaking, but it was clear. I am not here against my will. Grimm let out a sharp, barking laugh. Of course she would say that. What other choice has this man given her? He has her trapped here, miles from anyone, a prisoner of his wealth. She is a pauper, a desperate woman. It is coercion. Marshal. Plain and simple. The law is the law. She must be returned. I am not a prisoner, Sarah said, her voice rising, stronger now. Then you are his mistress, Arthur Brennan spat, his face purple. You are living in sin, bringing more shame to us. A low growl went through the assembled cowhands. Billy's hand moved, almost unconsciously, to rest on the butt of his pistol. James Cordell still did not move. He let the ugly words hang in the dry, hot air. He let the poison spread. He let them empty themselves of all their venom. When they were finally silent, he spoke, his voice as flat and cold as a winter stone. Marshal, he said, you are, I am told, a man who respects the law. I am, Thorne said, shifting uncomfortably. Then you will respect these. Cordell stepped back into his office and returned a moment later with a sheaf of papers. He did not hand them to Grimm. He handed them directly to the marshal. My foreman has been in Prescott for the last 2 weeks. Cordell stated, that, marshal, is a copy of the land registry for your county. You will note 6 properties, all belonging to widows or grieving families, that have been foreclosed on by Mr. Grimm's bank. And you will note, on the following pages, that all 6 properties were sold at auction for almost nothing, Autopro 2 to a holding company, a company owned by Mr. Grimm's cousin in Philadelphia. Grimm's smug expression vanished. His face went a dead papery white. This is Autopro 2, this is slander, this is private business. I am afraid it is public business. Marshal, Cordell continued, his voice relentless. When it becomes a pattern of fraud, but that is not even the most interesting part. He produced a second, smaller document. This, he said, holding it up, is a sworn affidavit from a former clerk at the Prescott Assay Office, a man who witnessed Thomas Brennan sign his original loan agreement. The agreement, you will note, was 1 page. The agreement Mr. Grimm presented at the auction, the one with his widow's forfeiture clause, was 2 pages. What are you saying? Marshal Thorne asked. His eyes narrow. I am saying, Cordell replied, that the signature on that 2nd page Autopro 2 is a forgery. Thomas Brennan never signed that clause. He never agreed to it, which means it is not a legal document. It is a piece of paper used for theft. Arthur Brennan looked at Grimm. Forgery, Horace? You said Autopro 2. You told me it was legal Autopro 2. You fool, Grimm hissed, his composure shattering. It means, Cordell said, overriding him, that you, Mr. Grimm, have no claim on Mrs. Brennan. You never did. You built your fortune on lies and the grief of widows. Grimm, truly cornered, his entire world crumbling, lost his mind. He lunged, not at Cordell, but at the papers in the marshal's hand. He is lying. He is trying to steal her. That woman belongs to the town. He has bewitched her. Billy and another cowhand grabbed Grimm by the arms, restraining him. The man was sputtering, his face a mask of pure, reptilian rage. Cordell ignored the screaming man. He ignored the stunned marshal. He ignored the gasping, pale face of Arthur Brennan. He turned, at last, to Sarah. The entire porch, the entire ranch, seemed to fall away. There was only this man, his gray eyes stripped bare of all their ghosts, all their coldness. He was looking at her, truly seeing her, for the first time. Sarah, he said, and his voice was so quiet, so raw, it cut her to the bone. I told you that you were not my servant. You are not. I auto-pro too. I have been a coward. I let the ghosts of my past blind me. I did to you exactly what they did. I offered you a different cage. I auto-pro too that I do not understand, she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. He took a step toward her. He did not try to touch her. He just held her with his gaze. I am not offering you protection. Sarah, I am not offering you a roof. I am asking Auto-Pro 2 if you can find it in you to stand beside me, as my equal. The screaming from Grim had faded to a dull, angry sobbing. The marshal was watching, dumbfounded. The law's a strange thing, Cordell said, his eyes never leaving hers. It says a widow is a thing to be auctioned, a thing to be claimed, but a wife, Auto-Pro 2, a wife is a partner. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The richest, most powerful man in the valley looked as terrified as she had ever been. Sarah Brennan, he said, his voice shaking almost imperceptibly. Will you do me the honor, Auto-Pro 2, of marrying me? Silence. The high, lonely wind was the only sound. Sarah stared at him. This was not a business proposition. It was not a legal trick to save her. It was a confession. It was the man who had sat all night holding her dying child, the man who had secretly left wire for her chicken coop, the man who had been so broken by his past he could not see a future. It was him, all of him, laid bare. She was being offered a choice, not between two masters, not between justice and servitude, but between a life of solitary freedom, won by his evidence, and a life of shared risk, a life with him. She thought of the cold, lonely cabin with Thomas. She thought of the cold, lonely room in this house. She thought of the long, terrible night where he had fought for Emma, not as an owner, but as a father. She looked past him, at Horace Grimm, who was now a beaten, pathetic man. She looked at Arthur, a weakling who had tried to profit from her pain. She looked at the marshal, a man just trying to do his job. Then her eyes returned to James Cordell. She did not smile. Her face was as solemn as his. She lifted her chin, the way she had on the platform. But this time, it was not defiance. It was acceptance. James, she said. His name felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. Yes, I will. A lifetime of pain seemed to drain from his face. He nodded. Once, a short, sharp movement, as if sealing a vow. He turned back to the stunned audience. Marshal Thorne, this woman, my fiancée, has just accepted my proposal of marriage. She is no longer the widow Brennan. Her person and her property are now under my care as her husband-to-be. I believe your business in Salvation Point is concluded. Marshal Thorne, holding the damning evidence of Grimm's fraud, looked at the sputtering banker, then at Cordell, then at Sarah, who was standing tall, her child in her arms. He slowly put his hat back on his head. I believe it is. Mr. Cordell. He nodded to Sarah. Ma'am. He grabbed Horace Grimm by the arm. Mr. Grimm, you and I are going to have a long talk, and then I expect we will be taking a ride to Prescott to see the territorial judge. Grimm was led away, a broken, shrieking man. Arthur Brennan stood alone, pale and lost, until Billy jerked a thumb toward his horse. Get! They were gone. The wagon, the riders, the dust Auto-Pro 2, all of it vanished down the long road. Sarah stood on the porch, her entire body trembling. James Cordell was beside her. He had not touched her. He had not moved. He was just Auto-Pro 2 there, standing with her. The silence was back. But this time, it was not cold. It was full. She looked at him, this stranger who was now her future. And for the first time since Thomas had died, she did not feel alone. The dust from the wagon and the riders settled slowly, returning to the earth, as if the violence of the last hour had been nothing but a bad dream. The cowhands, who had stood as a silent, grim posse, let out a collective breath. Billy was the first to move, grinning as he slapped the dust from his hat onto his leg. "Congratulations, boss," he said, his voice loud in the new silence. "Ma'am." The other men murmured their agreement, tipping their hats to Sarah, their faces showing a relief that was almost as profound as her own. One by one, they turned and drifted back to their work, the crisis over, the rhythm of the ranch already reasserting itself. Mrs. Albright had not moved. She stood on the porch, her hands still clutched in her apron, her gaze fixed on James Cordell. He turned to her, a deep exhaustion in his eyes. She nodded once, a short, decisive dip of her chin. "Well, I suppose I will need to air out the master bedroom. It has not been used in 3 years." She looked at Sarah, her expression unreadable. "And the mistress's room. They will both need a thorough cleaning." She turned and disappeared into the house, her duty clear, her acceptance absolute. Sarah and James were left alone on the porch. Emma was asleep on Sarah's shoulder, her small face peaceful, oblivious to the fact that her entire life had just been altered. The silence that fell between them was vast and heavy, filled with the echoes of his proposal and her acceptance. James ran a hand over his face, his fingers trembling slightly. He looked at his boots, at the splintered wood of the porch, at anything but her. He began, his voice rough. That was not Auto Pro 2, I had not planned to say that. Sarah's heart, which had been pounding, seemed to stop. "You did not. I planned to show Thorne the evidence. The forgery, that was all." He looked up, and his gray eyes were full of a raw, desperate honesty. "The rest Auto Pro 2, it just Auto Pro 2 it came out? But I meant it. Sarah, every word." She held his gaze, her own fear and hope swirling so intensely she could barely breathe. "I meant it, too." A new, profound awkwardness descended. He was her fiancé, this man who had been her master, her keeper, her cold, distant savior, was now the man she had agreed to marry. He was a stranger, and she knew him better than anyone on earth. He cleared his throat, stepping back, putting a small, respectful distance between them. "I have to ride to Prescott. I must speak to the judge myself. I need to be sure Thorne files the charges properly to give my testimony." "Of course," Sarah said, nodding. It was a practical, necessary step. It was a world she understood. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on her. "Will you Auto Pro 2? Will you be here when I get back?" It was the real question. It was not about the law. It was about her. She looked at him, and she knew she could not lie, could not give him a simple, easy answer. "I have nowhere else to go." "James." A shadow of pain crossed his face. He had heard the truth in her words. "That is not what I meant." She softened, seeing the vulnerability he was showing for the first time. "I will be here." He nodded. "Once. Good. That is good." He turned, walked to the stables, and in less than 10 minutes, he was on a fresh horse, riding hard for Prescott. He was gone for 5 days. The ranch itself seemed to hold its breath, but everything had changed. Mrs. Albright, in her own way, began the transition. She no longer asked Sarah to scrub the kitchen floor. Instead, she asked her opinion. "Mr. Cordell will be returning soon. He always favored Auto Pro 2, or he used to favor Auto Pro 2, a thick pot roast after a long ride. Do you think that is suitable, ma'am?" The "ma'am" was a small shock every time she heard it. Sarah found herself being consulted on menus, on linen, on the schedules of the 2 young women who came from a nearby homestead to help with the laundry. She was being woven into the very fabric of the house, and it was a terrifying and humbling feeling. Mrs. Albright, practical as ever, had addressed the sleeping arrangements. "This is not proper," she had said, gesturing to Sarah's small room. "The mistress's room, next to Mr. Cordell's, has been prepared." Sarah had walked into the room and had frozen. It was beautiful, large and airy, with a tall, carved wooden bed and a window that looked out over the valley. But it was a shrine. It was filled with a woman's possessions. A silver-backed brush lay on the dresser. A row of small, leather-bound poetry books sat on the nightstand. It smelled of lavender and dust. It was Eleanor's room. "I cannot," Sarah had whispered, backing out. "It is Autopro 2. It is too much. I will stay in my room. For now." Mrs. Albright had looked at her, a rare, soft understanding in her eyes. "As you wish, but he will not want you in the servants' quarters. Ma'am, not for long." Sarah retreated to the one place that felt truly hers, the garden. She knelt in the dirt, her hands working with a new purpose. Before, she had been planting for survival, a few vegetables to earn her keep. Now, as she pressed seeds into the dark, rich earth, she was planting for a future. She was planting for a family. This was no longer a servant's plot. This was her garden. James returned late on the 5th day. He was covered in dust and looked as if he had not slept in a week, but the iron hardness around his eyes was gone. He looked Autopro 2 lighter. He did not go to his study. He found her in the kitchen, where she was rocking Emma in the quiet of the evening. He did not knock. He just entered, and sat down heavily at the small kitchen table, a place he had never sat before. She stood and poured him a cup of coffee. She placed it in front of him. This simple, domestic act felt more intimate, more binding than the public proposal. "It is done," he said, his voice weary. He wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "Grimm is in the territorial prison in Prescott. He Autopro 2, he confessed to everything. The forgery, the other properties. He implicated your brother-in-law. Said Arthur knew the document was false and had agreed to it in exchange for your land." Sarah sat down opposite him, her heart cold. "Arthur." "The marshal is on his way to Salvation Point. Arthur will be arrested as well. Grimm Autopro 2. He will not see daylight for a very long time." The judge was appalled. He went through all the bank's records himself. James reached into his saddlebag, which he had dropped by the door. He pulled out a packet of papers. Tied with a string, he pushed it across the table. "This is from the judge. It is a court order, nullifying the widow's forfeiture clause. Not just for you, for everyone. It is declared fraudulent." He slid a second paper from the packet. "And this is the deed to your land, your cabin, free and clear. The judge also awarded you damages from what the court could seize of Grimm's estate. It is not a fortune, but Autopro 2, it is yours." Sarah stared at the papers. The deed to her home, money. She was free, truly, legally, financially free. She could take Emma, take this money, go back to her cabin, and Autopro 2 and what try to farm the rocks be the town pariah, the woman who had brought down the bank. She looked up at him. Her voice was very small, a dry whisper. "So," she said, her eyes fixed on his. "The Autopro 2, the wedding Autopro 2, it is not necessary, for legal reasons." He looked down into his coffee cup. He seemed to be studying the dark liquid. "No, it is not." A terrible, heavy silence filled the small kitchen. He had given her an escape. He had given her back her life. And with it, the choice to leave his... "Sarah," he said, his voice still low. He looked up, and his gray eyes were stripped bare. "I told you I was a coward. I have been for 3 years. I have used my grief as a shield. It was my excuse for being half a man, for being a ghost in my own home." His hands were clasped so tightly on the mug, his knuckles were white. "When I saw you on that platform, I was not saving you. I was saving my wife. Her name was Eleanor." He told her everything. The broken wagon wheel, the high pass, the scream that he still heard in his sleep, the long drop into the canyon. He told her about the banker in that town, the man just like Grimm. "I brought you here to Autopro 2, I do not know. To fix the past, a monument to my own failure. And I was cold to you. Sarah, Because looking at you Auto Pro 2 and at Emma Auto Pro 2, it hurt. It was a constant reminder of everything I had lost. He pushed his chair back and stood up, pacing the small space between the stove and the table. And then, he said, his voice thick with emotion, it stopped hurting. I would see you out in that patch of dirt you turned into a garden, your hands covered in soil, and I was not seeing Eleanor. She hated the dirt. I was seeing you. I saw you mending that chicken coop with bits of scrap wood. I saw your strength, and that night Auto Pro 2 with Emma. His voice broke. He stopped, his back to her, fighting for control. That night, you were so strong. You were so brave. I Auto Pro 2. I was the one who was weak. He turned to face her. The proposal on the porch, that was for them. For Grimm. For the Marshal. For the world. It was the only weapon I had to protect you. He walked to her, stopping in front of her chair. He did not touch her. This, he said, his voice dropping, is for me, and for you. He gestured to the papers on the table. You are free, Sarah Brennan. You can take your daughter, you can take that money, and you can walk away from this ranch, and no one will ever stop you. Your life is your own. She looked up at him, at this powerful, broken man who had just handed her back her entire world, and in doing so, had risked his own. She saw the fear in his eyes, the fear that she would say yes, that she would leave. And what if Auto Pro 2, she said, her own voice trembling. What if my life Auto Pro 2, what if I wanted to be here with you? He closed his eyes, a deep, shuddering breath escaping him. For a moment, he just stood there, absorbing her words. That is all I wanted to hear. But, she said, finding a new strength, I will not live in her room. I will not be a ghost's replacement. I will not be your second choice. James. His eyes snapped open, and they were clear and fierce. Never. You are not a replacement. You are Auto Pro 2. You are the woman I see. It is just a room. We can Auto Pro 2. We can burn it. We can build a new house. Whatever you want. I like this house, she said, a small, tentative smile touching her lips. It is a good, strong house, but it needs curtains and flowers. A slow smile spread across his face. It was the first true smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed him, chasing the last of the shadows from his eyes. Curtains, yes, I think it does. And flowers. He reached out, slowly, as if afraid she might bolt. He did not take her hand. He gently, with a reverence that made her heart ache, brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was a question. James, she whispered, not moving away. I Auto Pro 2. I do not love you, not in the way a wife should, not yet. I am Auto Pro 2. I am so full of gratitude, and I respect you. I see the good man you are, but Auto Pro 2. I know, he said, his hand dropping. That is more than I deserve. That is enough. Love Auto Pro 2, that is something we can grow, like your garden. It just needs good soil and water and time. He offered her his arm, a formal, old-world gesture. Will you walk with me, Sarah, just on the porch? She looked at his arm. Then she stood, smoothed her apron, and slid her hand into the crook of his elbow. It felt strong. It felt right. She let him lead her out of the kitchen, out of the shadows, and into the cool, clear night air. The ranch was quiet. The sky was a black velvet blanket of stars. Their future was unwritten, but for the first time, it was theirs. They stood on the porch, wrapped in the cool, silent darkness of the high desert. The stars overhead were sharp, in different diamonds. For a long time, neither of them moved. The space between them, the few feet of worn planking, felt as wide as the valley. James was the first to speak. His voice was rough, as if it hurt his throat. That was a terrible proposal. Sarah looked at him. She saw not the powerful rancher, but the man who had just confessed his deepest wounds in his own kitchen. He was right. It had been She said it was a legal matter. He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the dark line of the mountains. The first one? On this porch. That was a legal matter. That was a shield. His next words were so quiet, she had to lean in to hear them. The next one will not be... He turned and looked at her, his face a map of exhaustion and a new, fragile hope. Get some sleep. Sarah. He did not say ma'am. He did not say Mistress Brennan. He just said her name. The days that followed were suspended in a strange, sunlit quiet. The news from Prescott was final and decisive. Horace Grimm, faced with the unassailable evidence of his forgery and a long list of other defrauded families, was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. His property was seized. Arthur Brennan, his reputation in Salvation Point destroyed, his cowardice and greed exposed, was given a choice face trial as an accomplice or leave the territory. He left, disappearing on an eastbound stage, a bitter, broken man. The threat was over. It was truly, finally, gone. Sarah woke up each morning in her small servant's room, and for the first time, she knew she could walk out the front door. She could take the deed, take the money the court had awarded her, and she could leave. She could go anywhere. And every morning, she got up, dressed, and went to the kitchen. She collected the eggs from her chickens. She worked in her garden, which was now thriving, providing crisp lettuce and bright radishes for the ranch. She did not leave. She found she did not want to. James was different. The cold, hard wall he had lived behind for 3 years was gone. He was still quiet, still reserved, but he was present. He no longer ate alone in his study. He took his meals in the dining room. At first, it was just him and Sarah, a silent, awkward expanse of polished wood between them. Then, he asked Mistress Albright to join them. Then he invited his foreman. The house, once a silent tomb, began to fill with the sound of conversation, of boots on the floor, of quiet laughter. He was, Sarah realized with a jolt of amused understanding, terrified of her. He was a man who could command 50 cowhands, who could face down a swindler, who ruled a cattle empire, and he was shy around the woman he had asked to marry. He would bring her small, strange gifts from his rides, a cluster of quartz he had found by the creek, a sprig of wild sage, its scent clean and sharp, a hawk's feather. He was, in his own way, courting her. One evening, a week after his return, he found her by the chicken coop, securing the latch for the night. Emma was on her hip, babbling at the birds. James stopped a few feet away, turning his hat in his hands. "Sarah," he said. "Yes, James. Tomorrow, if the weather holds, I would like to Autopro too. I would like to show you something. On the high ridge." She had never been to the high ridge. It was the highest point on his land. She nodded. "I would like that." He rode with her the next afternoon. She sat on a gentle mare, holding Emma in front of her. He led them up a narrow switchback trail, the valley falling away below them, the air growing thinner and cooler. They rode out of the brush and onto a high, flat promontory. The world opened up. She gasped. From here, she could see everything. The entire Cordell Ranch, a vast green and gold tapestry laid out between the purple arms of the mountains. She saw the creek, a silver ribbon. She saw the clusters of cattle, like small dark specks. She saw the ranch house, so small and solid, nestled in its cottonwoods. "This is Autopro too," she whispered. "It is the whole world." "It is my world," he said, his voice quiet beside her. He had dismounted and now stood at her stirrup, his hand resting on the mare's neck. "This is what I built." Or Autopro 2, what Eleanor and I started to build. Sarah's heart tightened, but she remained silent. He looked out at the land, his gaze distant. After she died, this all became Autopro 2, a fortress, something to hide behind. It was just land. It was just work. It had no heart. It was just a big, empty accomplishment. He turned his gaze from the valley to her. Until you came. You, with your garden in that hard patch of dirt. You, mending that broken coop. You, fighting for your daughter. You brought life back to this place. Sarah, you brought it back to me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn velvet box. He did not kneel. He stood tall as her equal. I told you the next one would not be a legal matter. He opened the box. Inside was a simple, beautiful gold ring, set with a single, clear blue turquoise. This was my mother's. It was not Eleanor's. I have kept it for Autopro 2, I do not know, for the right woman. He looked at Emma, who was staring at him with bright, curious eyes. Then his gaze met Sarah's. I am not offering you protection. I am not offering you a name to hide behind. I am offering you my hand, my partnership. I am offering you all of this. He swept his arm out, indicating the valley. And I am offering you my whole heart, such as it is. I am asking you to build a life with me. I am asking if you will let me be a father to your daughter. Tears, hot and sudden, blurred Sarah's vision. This was not the gratitude she had felt before. This was not respect. This was something new, a deep, warm unfolding in her chest. This was the love he had spoken of. This was the garden, growing. She nodded, unable to speak. She held out her left hand. He took it, his own hand rough and warm and trembling. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. The wedding was 2 weeks later. It was not held in a church. It was held on the ranch, under the giant cottonwood tree by the creek that gave the valley its life. The judge from Prescott, an old friend of James's father, came to officiate. There were no guests from town. There was only family. Mistress Albright stood beside Sarah, her face stern, but her eyes were shining. She had produced a beautiful, simple lace veil from a trunk in the attic, one that had belonged to James's mother. Billy, his hair slicked down, stood beside James as his best man. All the cowhands were there, their hats in their hands, their faces scrubbed clean. James wore a fine black suit, one Sarah had never seen. He looked impost color, a stark, handsome stranger, but his eyes were only for her. Sarah wore her best calico dress and her mother-in-law's veil. She carried a bundle of wildflowers from her own garden. The judge spoke of partnership, of resilience, of building a new life in a hard land. James spoke his vows in a clear, strong voice, a promise not of romance, but of fidelity, of partnership, of steadfastness. When it was Sarah's turn, her voice was quiet, but it did not waver. She promised to stand by him, to build with him, to be his partner and his wife. When the judge said, "You may kiss your bride," a hush fell. This was the moment of truth. James stepped forward. He lifted the veil, his eyes searching hers. He did not kiss her with passion. He kissed her with a profound, gentle reverence, a soft press of his lips to hers. It was a promise. It was a beginning. Billy let out a whoop, and the cowhands cheered. The celebration was a ranch barbecue, with fiddles and roasted beef, and laughter that echoed through the valley. Their new life started not with a honeymoon, but with a conversation. The day after the wedding, James stood with Sarah outside the door to Eleanor's room. "This is your house. Sarah," he said, "whatever you want to do, we can burn it all." She shook her head. "No, she was a part of you. We cannot erase her. But Autopro 2, we can put her to rest." Together, they opened the room. Together, they packed the silver-backed brushes, the poetry books, the faded dresses. They were not burying a ghost. They were honoring a memory. James was quiet, his face sad but peaceful. When they were done, he closed the trunk and moved it to the attic. He closed the door. For a week, they did not sleep in the same room. He slept in his study, giving her time. Sarah, In the meantime, was transforming the house. The curtains she had promised appeared, bright calico that let in the sun. She filled the vases with her flowers. She moved the heavy furniture. She scrubbed the masculine silence from the walls, replacing it with the scent of baking bread and the sound of Emma's gurgling. She moved her own things into the master bedroom, the one that had been his. She put her own small tintype of Thomas on the dresser. James saw it, and he nodded. He did not want her to forget her past, just as she was helping him live with his. One night, she found him asleep in the chair in his study, a ledger open on his lap. He looked exhausted. She touched his shoulder. "James," she said gently, "come to bed." He woke, disoriented. He looked at her, then at the cot he had been using. She held out her hand. "Come to our bed." He took her hand, and he followed her. Their love grew as he said it would, like a garden. It was not a flash flood of passion. It was a slow, deep spring, steady and sure. It grew in the quiet moments. It grew when they worked on the ledgers together. Sarah's sharp eye for numbers saving him a costly mistake on a cattle feed contract. It grew when he taught her to ride, his hand gentle on her back, teaching her the balance of the saddle. Most of all, it grew around Emma. James was awkward with her at first. He had no practice with children. He was afraid of his own strength, afraid of this small, fragile life. He would watch Sarah hold her, his face a mixture of longing and fear. One evening, Emma, who was just learning to walk, tottered across the floor, right to his boots. She stumbled and sat down hard. She looked up at this tall, serious man, her face crumpled, ready to cry. James froze. Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway, her heart in her throat. He knelt, slowly, his knees cracking. He held out one large, calloused finger. Emma, her tears forgotten, grabbed it in her tiny, perfect fist. She pulled herself up, using him as an anchor. Then she beamed, a wide, toothless smile. James's iron control, the last wall around his heart, crumbled into dust. He scooped her up, burying his face in her soft hair, his shoulders shaking with a silent, breaking sob. Sarah came and wrapped her arms around them both. This was their family, not a replacement, not a second choice. It was a new, whole, beautiful thing, born of hardship and built on respect. Life continued. The ranch thrived. The house that had been a silent fortress was now a home, filled with the sounds of a growing, happy child. Sarah and James were a true partnership. They were seen riding the property together, James pointing out a distant herd, Sarah pointing out a new place for a garden. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, as they had that first night, but now the silence was a comfort, not a chasm. He would have his arm around her. She would lean her head on his shoulder. Emma would be asleep in her crib inside. They would watch the stars. No longer strangers, but two halves of a whole, forged in the harsh, beautiful, unforgiving fire of the West. They had found their justice, not in a courtroom, but in each other. They had found their freedom, not in the law, but in a love strong enough to heal. Thank you for listening to this story. I would love to hear where you are tuning in from, so please share in the comments so we can all connect. Do not forget to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night, for more stories like this.